My name is Whitney Hayes. I am 36 years old. And last Christmas, my father ended whatever remained of our family with a single voicemail. He didn't hesitate or search for words. He didn't sound emotional or strained. His voice was calm, clipped, almost administrative, the way someone speaks when confirming an appointment that's already been decided. We all agreed, "You're not welcome at Christmas." Then the call ended. I didn't dial back. I didn't send a message asking what he meant or why. I sat there with my phone resting in my hand, listening to the silence that followed his voice, and in that quiet something inside me finally locked into place. For years, I had been the one making sure the house in Towson never slipped. The mortgage that swallowed half my paycheck every month never missed a due date. The electric and gas stayed on, keeping lights bright and heat steady through winter. The cleaning service arrived before every holiday, leaving the house polished and untouched looking. The catering deposits were always paid when my parents decided to host big, the kind of gatherings my father loved to boast about. And still, they spoke about me as if I were the difficult one, the distant one, the daughter who never quite did enough. They never realized that every time my bank balance dropped to nothing, theirs remained comfortably full. So after that voicemail, I didn't argue with anyone. I didn't demand explanations or plead for inclusion. I opened my laptop. I pulled up every account tied to my name and began closing doors. The mortgage, $3,600 a month. The electric, the gas, the internet. Even the $6,000 catering reservation my father had been bragging about to his friends. I clicked confirm again and again, each decision quiet, deliberate, final. On Christmas Eve, their house went dark. Ovens shut down mid-prep. Music cut off. Credit cards declined. Guests stood awkwardly, coats in hand, glancing at one another. By noon the next day, my phone was filled with calls and messages, all circling the same question. "What did you do?" Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story will travel. A few days earlier, the shift in my family had already begun, though it moved quietly enough that I almost missed it. It started with my inbox, the one I checked every morning out of habit. Most years, holiday messages arrived steadily. Short updates, reminders about who was bringing what, lists of guests my father wanted to impress. That season, my inbox stayed empty. At first, I told myself people were busy. But the silence carried weight, as if I had stepped out of a room without realizing the door had closed behind me. Curious, I opened the shared drive we always use for holiday planning. It had never been restricted. I uploaded grocery lists and finalized schedules there every year. This time, the screen loaded blank, followed by a notice saying I no longer had permission. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to understand when and why I had been locked out without a word. Not long after, my mother, Linda Hayes, the person who usually made sure everyone stayed connected, sent me a message. It felt rehearsed, short, soft, almost too gentle, the way you speak when you don't want to explain much. She hinted that the season was hectic, that some things were being rearranged without saying what those things were. Reading it felt like stepping onto ice, sudden and disorienting. The distance didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. Small moments, irregular but unmistakable, stacking quietly on top of one another. Every time I unlocked my phone, I expected signs of the usual holiday buildup. Instead, there was nothing to hold on to. The house in Towson should have been buzzing by then, lists taped to countertops, reminders stuck to the fridge, my father pretending not to notice any of it. That year, instead of energy growing, something was shrinking. One evening after work, I remembered the tension from the previous Christmas, when I had arrived a few minutes late and felt eyes shift toward me instead of the door. My sister, Shannon Hayes, had spoken in a bright, performative tone that didn't match her expression. At the time, I dismissed it as a bad moment. Looking back, it felt more like a warning I hadn't understood. The next sign came from something quieter. The family group chat. I rarely posted, but it carried the rhythm of our holidays. When I scrolled through it out of habit, it felt oddly still. No photos, no updates, no reminders. I noticed the banner at the top looked different. The title had changed. I waited before opening the member list, half expecting to see my name there like always. It wasn't. The realization didn't shock me. It arrived with a sense of confirmation, like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place after days of uncertainty. As I stared at the screen, a new message came in, not from the group, but from my cousin Renee Jennings. Her text was brief. She said she thought a second chat had been created. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. In that moment, the pattern became visible, even if no one had said it out loud. Later that week, restlessness settled into my routine. Ordinary tasks felt slightly off, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I tried focusing on work, but the quiet gaps in my family's behavior kept resurfacing, nudging me toward questions I had avoided for years. One night after finishing dinner in my apartment, I opened my laptop with a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. I started with the mortgage account. It had been active for 4 years, long enough that I navigated it without hesitation. I entered my credentials and waited as the dashboard loaded. The numbers appeared quickly: monthly payments, outstanding balance, automatic withdrawal dates. My name sat beside the account details just as it always had. But as I scrolled deeper, something shifted. The property deed, which I had barely looked at when the loan was first approved, listed only one owner: my father, Thomas Hayes. Seeing his name alone wasn't surprising. What unsettled me was the clarity of my own role. I wasn't a co-owner, I wasn't even someone with shared responsibility. I was simply the secondary signer, the one who made the loan possible and whose bank account kept it alive month after month. I clicked through the transaction history. Line after line showed the same pattern: my money leaving, the loan updating, the house continuing as if it were a shared effort, yet nothing tied me to ownership. No document acknowledged the years I had carried the financial weight. The more I reviewed, the more the arrangement felt less like support and more like an invisible obligation that had grown roots around my life. I moved on to the utility accounts: electricity, gas, internet, the systems that kept the house running through Maryland winters. All of them were under my name, billed to my address in Baltimore, set to automatic payments I had almost forgotten activating. I scrolled through archived statements, recognizing seasons by spikes in heating costs and dips in summer usage. The pattern was familiar, but the intention behind it now felt different. It was clear I had been woven into the infrastructure of a home that no longer felt connected to me. Next came the cleaning service and the history of holiday preparations. Dozens of invoices documented years of appointments scheduled without question, each aligned with gatherings my father insisted on hosting. He took pride in opening the doors of the Towson house, presenting it as a symbol of stability. No one ever asked who made sure the carpets looked untouched or who paid the team that arrived before dawn. As I organized the files, memories surfaced: birthdays, graduations, family events where it was simply assumed I would handle the practical things. People praised the Hayes family for being dependable, generous, well-prepared. They never knew the work behind it came from someone who rarely appeared in the photos. By the time I closed the last tab, the unease I'd been carrying had changed shape. The evidence wasn't emotional. It wasn't interpretive. It was numerical, structured, and unmistakable. I wasn't imagining the distance. I wasn't misreading signals. There was a system in place, and I had become part of it without ever questioning my position. The following evening, the documents stayed with me, not because I needed more proof, but because they hinted at a larger pattern I still couldn't fully name. I moved around my apartment without settling, folding laundry, washing a dish, checking the time. Each task interrupted by the quiet understanding that there were still pieces missing. When my phone buzzed just after 9, the screen lit up with a name I didn't expect to see at that hour: my cousin Renee Jennings. Her message was brief, asking if I was alone and able to talk. Something in the wording made me pause. Renee wasn't dramatic by nature. She didn't exaggerate or stir conflict. Her tone carried a weight that didn't belong to casual conversation. I stepped into the living room and called her back, unsure what I was about. To hear when she answered, her voice held the tightness of someone trying to decide how much truth to reveal. She told me she had stopped by the house in Towson earlier that day. She didn't frame it as a visit. She described it as passing through, the way someone might downplay a moment they wish they hadn't witnessed. She explained that she had walked into a conversation she never intended to hear. My name had come up before she even realized who was speaking. I stayed quiet as she continued, her hesitation growing with each detail. She said she had recorded a portion of the conversation only because it startled her, because the words sounded deliberate, not spoken in frustration or confusion. She didn't go into specifics on the phone. She only emphasized that it was something I deserved to know. I felt the same stillness that had followed my father's voicemail, the kind that rearranges the air around you. She sent the audio without another explanation. It arrived in my inbox later, a small icon that seemed far too ordinary for what it contained. I opened it and pressed play. The recording was short, but every second carried precision. The voices were unmistakable. My father spoke with the authority he used when presenting plans rather than discussing them. Shannon's tone followed with a sharpness I recognized. It was the voice she used when aligning herself with whatever direction benefited her most. Another voice joined, calm, measured, familiar in a way that made its presence even more calculated. The words were not shouted or emotional. They were steady, almost administrative. They weren't debating my role, they were defining it. In the short exchange, each of them shaped a version of me that existed only in the space where convenience mattered more than connection. I listened once, then again, absorbing the distance in their voices. There was no uncertainty, no pause that hinted at reluctance. The clarity was unmistakable. By the third playback, something inside me shifted. The discomfort that had been building no longer felt diffuse. It formed into a steady understanding and articulation of what the documents in the silence had already suggested. The recording wasn't a revelation, it was confirmation of what had been unfolding for much longer than I had acknowledged. It brought structure to the unease, turning scattered impressions into a coherent truth. When I finally closed the file, the room felt still, not in a hollow or echoing way, but in the way a decision begins to take shape long before it's expressed aloud. 2 days later, the clarity that had settled over me hadn't faded. It didn't flare like anger or shake like grief. It moved quietly, aligning itself with the facts I could no longer ignore. I woke earlier than usual, sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop with the same deliberate composure I used whenever I organized my work files. Nothing about the morning looked unusual, but the intention guiding it was something I hadn't felt before. I started with a list, not the emotional kind, but a practical outline of every account tied to my name: mortgage, electric, gas, internet, trash collection, cleaning service, holiday related services I had scheduled on behalf of the Towson house. Familiarity of each item struck me, not because I interacted with them often, but because they had existed in the background for so long that my involvement had become instinctual. The mortgage was first. I logged in, reviewed the next scheduled payment, and hovered over the setting that controlled automatic withdrawals. There was no hesitation when I disabled it. The action felt straightforward, almost procedural. I wasn't undoing a commitment, I was stepping out of a role that had never been mine to hold indefinitely. Next came the electric account. The interface offered a calendar where I could choose the disconnection date. I selected the afternoon of Christmas Eve, not out of spite, but because it aligned with the billing cycle and ensured the request was processed cleanly. The gas account followed the same pattern. Each confirmation email slid into my inbox, a neat row forming a trail of decisions made without apology. I moved through the remaining services with the same methodical approach: the internet plan, the trash collection schedule, the cleaning contract that had been active for years. All of them were structured around the house as if it were a shared cornerstone. Removing myself felt less like altering a system and more like correcting an imbalance I had overlooked. The catering order required more steps. I accessed the portal where the reservation for the holiday event had been logged. The invoice reflected $6,000 in total, with my card listed as the primary payment method. I sub a request to remove the card and redirect the billing to the account on file under the event host's name. The form asked for a justification. I typed a concise explanation, attached nothing further, and submitted it. The confirmation arrived minutes later. As the inbox filled with automated responses, I created a folder labeled completed changes. Each message was dragged inside chronologically, precisely, without commentary. This wasn't retaliation, it was organization. It was the same attention to detail I had applied for years, redirected towards something that finally included my own well-being. When I finished, I sat back and reviewed the folder containing the mortgage documents. utility histories, and images of the payments I had made over 4 years. None of it surprised me anymore. The numbers, the patterns, the silence surrounding them, they formed a structure I understood completely now. I didn't lighter or heavier, just steady. I close the laptop, not abruptly, not with triumph, but with the certainty that comes from recognizing the boundaries I should have placed long ago. Every account I had shut down existed because I had maintained it. Ending them was not an act of harm, it was a decision to stop participating in something that no longer acknowledged me. Christmas Eve arrived with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. I moved through my apartment with an ease that surprised me, preparing a simple dinner without the pressure that usually settled over the day. In other years, I would have been on the highway to Towson, timing my arrival around expectations I didn't set. This year, the absence of those expectations left room for something I hadn't felt in a long time. Quiet. I ate alone at my small kitchen table, not rushed, not late, not anticipating anyone's reaction. Afterward, I chose a movie and let it play in the background while I settled onto the couch. Nothing dramatic shifted in the room. There were no revelations or grand realizations, only an awareness that the decisions I had made were already moving forward on their own. The first vibration from my phone came just after 6. I didn't reach for it immediately. When I eventually checked, the screen displayed a notification preview, brief, disjointed, and sent in a tone I recognized from years of disorganization. Another message arrived seconds later from a different number. Neither offered clarity, only fragments that hinted at urgency. I placed the phone beside me without opening anything. A few minutes passed, then the vibrations grew more frequent, clustered like a pattern forming without permission. I turned the screen over. More alerts populated the stack. Short requests for explanations, mentions of disruptions, words that carried a sudden loss of control from the people who had held it comfortably for so long. None addressed me directly by name, none acknowledged the choices that had led us to this moment. I set the phone down again. It wasn't silence that followed, but the muted sound of distance arranging itself. The notifications continued, persistent rhythm, but I didn't feel pulled toward them. Instead, I focused on the faint hum of the heater in my apartment and the steady beat of the movie's soundtrack. The contrast between the calm in my living room and the chaos implied by those messages created a kind of separation I hadn't anticipated. Then a new alert appeared, distinct from the others. It was from Renee. Her message didn't carry panic, only information, given plainly, the way she always delivered difficult truths. She told me something had shifted in the Towson house. Movement, confusion, people searching for explanations that no one could provide. I read her words, slowly, aware that they came from someone who understood both sides of the situation more clearly than most. I didn't respond right away. There was no urgency to feel the quiet. Whatever was unfolding did not require my involvement, and for the first time, that realization didn't bring guilt. It simply felt accurate. Another cluster of notifications followed, longer, less controlled, sent in quick succession. I watched them appear on the screen without opening any. Their presence didn't demand a reaction. They existed as evidence of a structure that had operated for years without acknowledging my role, now reacting to its own imbalance. Eventually, I placed the phone face down once more and let the room return to stillness. The evening continued without interruptions, steady and uncomplicated. There was nothing left to initiate, no steps to monitor, no immediate decisions waiting for me. Everything that needed to be set in motion was already underway. I let the movie play until the end, then turned off the lights in my apartment with the simple awareness that the night was carrying forward exactly as it needed to. The days that followed moved with a kind of steady momentum, as if the decisions I had made were now carrying their own weight without needing anything from me. I woke early, the morning after Christmas, and found an email from Kevin waiting in my inbox. His review of the accounts was concise. Everything I had changed fell within my rights as the account holder. There was no breach, no grounds for dispute, no angle from which anyone could argue that I had acted improperly. The clarity of his message brought a sense of finality that felt less like vindication and more like acknowledgement of what had already been true. By midday, another development surfaced. A piece written by Monica appeared in a local publication, focusing on the quiet, unspoken financial roles that shape family systems. She didn't use names, but the descriptions were unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Towson community. I read the article once, then closed the tab. It didn't need my approval. It simply held a mirror to something that had been operating in the open for years. Later that afternoon, Renee sent a brief update. Word had spread quickly among the circles my father moved in. His position as a host for the church charity, a role he valued for the image it created, was placed on hold while questions circulated about the finances behind previous events. No accusations, just scrutiny, the kind that makes people reconsider who they choose to place at the center of their gatherings. Not long after, Eric faced his own consequences at the bank. Internal reviews were conducted, his responsibilities were reassigned. The details were minimal, but the shift was unmistakable. Structures built on convenience rarely withstand close examination. I knew messages would find their way to me eventually, and they did. They arrived in a measured trickle, controlled wording, attempts to reframe, subtle appeals to familiarity. Each one positioned the disruption as something that had happened to them, rather than something they had created. I read the emails without responding. None acknowledged the reality of the arrangement or the years I had carried more than anyone cared to see. A week later, I submitted the paperwork to remove my name from the mortgage entirely. The process required signatures, verification, and a final review. Each step felt like closing a door that had been left open for reasons that no longer made sense. When the confirmation arrived, the release felt straightforward, not triumphant, not dramatic, simply accurate. Time moved forward in its usual way. Months passed, seasons changed. I rebuilt routines that didn't involve waiting for obligations I hadn't chosen. I learned the shape of my life when it wasn't bent around someone else's structure. A year later, on Christmas Eve, my apartment held a small gathering. Renee, Ruth, and a few friends who had become steady presences. There were no obligations, no performances, no roles to maintain. Just warmth, conversation, and the quiet relief of being somewhere I wasn't required to prove my place. Looking back, the lesson wasn't about punishment or correction. It was about understanding the difference between being included and being used, between supporting a family and being absorbed by it. Boundaries aren't acts of distance, they're acts of clarity. They show where participation ends and self-respect begins. If you've listened this far, thank you for giving space to my story, and if any part of it resonates with your own life, I hope it reminds you that stepping away from what diminishes you is not abandonment.